Utah has always been an anomaly when it comes to American states. While a staunchly Republican state now, it wasn't always the case, as there were times of Democratic dominance as well. But the one factor that cannot be ignored when it comes to the politics is the role of the LDS Church over the course of political history in Utah. This video is about the history of Utah's electoral politics, partisanship, and the role of the LDS Church in that political environment. Hello, my name is Dave, and welcome to Election History, where I do videos about the history of elections, campaigns, parties, candidates, and the like. If this is the kind of content you like, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Today's Patreon producer for this video is Jake Nelson. It's people like Jake and my other Patreon members that make this channel possible. You can also become a future Patreon producer by joining my Patreon. The link is below in the description. Now, let's go ahead and start with the video. Now, before we start, I want to say that a lot of the information for this video comes from the work of Frank H. Jonas, a former University of Utah professor who has written extensively about the political history in Utah. If you want to know about the history of politics in Western states, I highly recommend his book, Politics in the American West, published in 1968. I'll put that link down below in the description. As one can assume, the political beginnings in Utah came from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, who arrived in Utah in 1847. The political beginnings started with the state of Deseret, which was a state proposed by the LDS Church. A constitutional convention was set up, and a constitution was adopted on March 6, 1849, with a bicameral legislature that had a lower House chamber and an upper Senate chamber. While originally wanting to be a territory, mostly so that the church could have further autonomy in their own affairs, Deseret moved quickly to become a state because California was also getting ready to apply for statehood. The problem was that both Deseret and California were claiming statehood for the same territory. What California was claiming was all of modern-day California, while Deseret was claiming not just Utah, but 9 parts of what would eventually become other states. Another problem was the national debate around the expansion of slavery into Western territories and states, particularly those which Mexico ceded after the Mexican-American War. Instead of receiving statehood, the Utah Territory was formed, which included most of Nevada and parts of Wyoming and Colorado, which was much smaller than the proposed state of Deseret. Now, with the Utah Territory being formed, elections were to be held for the territorial government. Being involved with politics was nothing new for the Mormons. In 1844, church founder Joseph Smith formed the Reform Party. No, not that Reform Party. And no, not that Reform Party either, and ran for president and received less than 1% of the vote. Even if Smith had been elected, he wouldn't have been able to serve because he had been killed by a mob 5 months earlier. His execution led to the Mormons' move westward and eventually settling in what would become Salt Lake City. After the territory was created, those elected to the state legislature and the territory's congressional seat were mostly picked by the church and ran with no opposition. According to Jonas, up until 1870, not a single candidate was elected without first being an approved candidate by the church. But just because they were approved by the church didn't mean that the candidates were Mormons themselves. John Kinney, who was appointed twice as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Territory of Utah by the federal government, was elected to Congress in Utah mostly because of his close relationship with the church, even though he himself wasn't a member of the church. However, that was all going to change in 1870. In the years preceding 1870, non-Mormon settlers had been moving westward in search for work. Some made their way to California, while others found their way to Utah, where there was a boom in the mining industry. While the LDS Church still controlled politics, many of the mining companies that had been operating in Utah were not connected with the LDS Church. Therefore, they didn't care if their employees that they hired were affiliated with the LDS Church or not. The non-Mormon population further increased with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. These new residents to Utah, many with no connection to the LDS Church whatsoever, didn't see politics in the state aligning with their own views. As a result, in 1870, the Liberal Party was formed, mostly to support workers and non Mormon residents. A year after the Liberal Party was established, the Salt Lake Tribune became the paper that supported the cause of the party, run by William S. Godbey, who was a Mormon but who was opposed to the policy of the church's leader, Brigham Young. Not only did the Salt Lake Tribune advocate for non Mormons, they were fiercely anti Mormon as well, an editorial stance that would last for decades. As a reaction to the formation of the Liberal Party, the People's Party was formed, which should not be confused with the People's Party that was formed in the early 1890s. The People's Party supported the continuation of Mormon domination in state politics. Of course, they continued to support the ideas of the church in politics, but the biggest issue was polygamy. The People's Party were champions for women's suffrage, but maybe not for the reason that you think. At the time the parties were formed, both Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had just formed their women's suffrage movement. But for the People's Party, which supported the practice of polygamy, this essentially meant that each man had multiple votes because he had multiple wives. While it might sound bad to say that women simply voted the way that their husbands had, a study done by political scientist Charles Merriam in 1924 found that women who had just been given the right to vote in 1920 usually followed their husband's lead, as being involved with politics for many women was a new experience. I'll link Merriam's work below in the description, as it is one of the only contemporaneous studies of women's voting habits at that time. One can't help to think that the feeling must have been compounded 50 years earlier in a polygamous society. When it came to statewide races, the Liberal Party wasn't successful due to the grip that the LDS Church had on state politics. However, when it came to some local elections, the Liberal Party had some success. Liberals won elections in both the 1874 and 1876 Tooele County election, jokingly now calling the county the Republic of Tooele. The People's Party would claim fraud, but the federal government backed the Liberals. The Liberals would also win the 1889 Ogden City election and the 1890 Salt Lake City election for mayor, with George M. Scott being the first non-Mormon mayor elected to the city. In 1891, the People's Party disbanded, with the Liberal Party disbanding a year later. But why did they disband? First was the Woodruff Manifesto, which was an official pronouncement by Church President Wilford Woodruff, which banned any future plural marriages within the church. Since both the People's Party, who was trying to keep polygamy going, and the Liberal Party, who was trying to eliminate it, made it their main issue, it essentially became a non-issue with the Woodruff Manifesto. But the second reason was that the national political parties were starting to invest in Utah. The first Democratic organization was organized on November 12, 1884, with the National Democrats coming into the state in 1888. The Republicans officially entered the state a little later. The reason why the parties decided to get involved with Utah politics was because they knew that at some date Utah would become a state, and with the manifesto, the likelihood of Utah's statehood grew. Because citizens of Utah wanted to achieve statehood, they wanted to make it look like the church didn't control affairs in the state. Obviously, the manifesto was a step in that direction, but when it came to politics, there was a worry that if all the church members sided with either the Democrats or Republicans, and non-Mormons simply sided with the other party, then the institution of the LDS Church in political affairs was still prominent. This is when the church came up with some interesting ways to make their state bipartisan. For example, when the church met at their state conferences, a semi-annual gathering of several wards, a church official from Salt Lake would come to the event, divide the audience down the center aisle, and say that those on one side were Democrats and those on the other side were Republicans. The church even went door to door, randomly assigning political parties to households. In the case of David O. McKay, a future president of the LDS Church, a church official went to his father's house in Huntsville, Utah to assign him a party. When his father told the official that he was a Jeffersonian Democrat, the official from Ogden said that he could keep his party affiliation and that he would simply just make the next household Republican. In 1896, Utah became a state. As a result, Utah was more involved with national politics than it was when it was just a territory. At first, the two political parties were equal, mostly because of the sorting that I mentioned before. But there were also two things that brought Utahns to the Republican side. First was the prominence of new Utah Senator Reed Smoot. Many of you might know Smoot as one of the architects who helped create the Great Depression, but Smoot was also a member of the LDS Quorum of the 12 Apostles. The Quorum of the 12 is basically like the Politburo of the LDS Church. Yes, put the hate comments down below because I just compared the LDS Church with communism, but that's about the best comparison that I can think of. Still, because he was a member of the 12, that put the Republican Party in a positive light. Also, since there was news that Smoot was a member of the Republican Party in 1888, he was probably someone who was a Republican before the LDS partisan sorting. Another reason Utah became more Republican was because of the 1904 Democratic Party platform. The platform had a plank about polygamy saying, quote, "We demand an extermination of polygamy within the jurisdiction of the United States and complete separation of church and state in political affairs." While this plank didn't mention the Mormons specifically, the fact that it mentioned both polygamy and separation of church and state, it was easily focused on one group of people. As a result, Teddy Roosevelt won Utah's 3 electoral votes with 61.4% of the votes. After the turn of the century, the Republican Party dominated the state. The main Republican battle was between two men, Reed Smoot and Thomas Kearns. As mentioned earlier, Smoot had gotten into the Senate primarily because he was a member of the 12. Remember, at this time, U.S. senators were still picked by state legislators, and the LDS Church had a great influence in the Utah state legislature. The other Republican senator at the turn of the century was Thomas Kearns, who was not a Mormon, but a Catholic and the owner of the Silver King mine in Park City. He was also heavily involved with the railroads, being a stockholder and director of the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad Company. He also secretly became part owner of the Salt Lake Tribune in 1901, but not until after being selected to the Senate, which is important for what comes up next. Kearns might have become a U.S. Senator, possibly by questionable means. On January 20th, 1901, the Salt Lake Tribune reported that Kearns had promised to use money from the rail company that he was the director of to purchase Salt Air, a resort on the Great Salt Lake that was owned by the church. This, in turn, made Lorenzo Snow, the president of the LDS Church, a supporter of Kearns' candidacy for the U.S. Senate. Therefore, it is seen as possibly the selling of a Senate seat by many. However, Snow and Kearns also had a good personal and business relationship, and there was never any proof that Kearns actually promised to purchase Saltair. In fact, another company purchased Saltair, and Kearns would still go on to be selected to the U.S. Senate. 10 months after Kearns was put in the U.S. Senate, Lorenzo Snow died. He was replaced by Joseph F. Smith, son of Hiram Smith, who was the brother of the church's founder, Joseph Smith. Smith was a supporter of Smoot, who wasn't a supporter of Kearns. In 1905, Kearns knew that he wasn't going to win re-election to the Senate, as the Republicans, under the direction of Smoot and Smith, chose George Sutherland, who would eventually go on to be a Supreme Court justice who was known for voting against much of the New Deal. Kearns was pissed. He left the Republican Party, started firing up the Salt Lake Tribune as an anti-Mormon paper again, and his supporters started a new party called the American Party. Right out of the gate, the American Party saw some success. Kearns' business partner Ezra Thompson, who served as mayor of Salt Lake City as a Republican between 1900 and 1903, was now elected to the same position as a member of the American Party in 1905. The American Party would also go on to control the Ogden and Salt Lake City governments, just like in the Liberal Party days. The party's platform in that election was primarily focused on the argument that church leaders were still practicing polygamy and had not abided by the 1890 manifesto. Just like the Liberal Party, the American Party didn't perform well statewide. Eventually, after a poor performance in 1910, the party disbanded. There just wasn't an appetite for a purely anti Mormon party anymore. As for Reed Smoot, he almost lost his Senate seat in 1907. For years, the U.S. Senate had been debating whether to remove Smoot or not. Many in Washington assumed that the LDS Church had still been practicing polygamy. Therefore, many senators thought that Smoot, who was still a member of the 12, should be removed since he was part of an organization that supported the law-breaking practice of polygamy. But Smoot didn't lose his seat and remained in the Senate. He was reelected to the U.S. Senate in 1914 in the first direct election for senators in Utah, but barely beat James Moyle, the founder of the Utah Democratic Party, by 2.6%. The political machine that Smoot had built to win over legislators was completely useless once direct elections were instituted. What Smoot was known for was his support for high tariffs. According to Jonas, this was to be the main issue in the state between 1907 and the advent of the New Deal in 1933, even before the infamous Smoot-Hawley Act, which was signed into law in 1930. Smoot supported higher tariffs. This was especially a problem since Utah was an export economy, especially when it came to natural resources and agricultural products that could only be produced in Utah's climate. Between 1907 and 1916, Utah would remain a Republican state. Both senators were Republican, the legislature was Republican, and in the 1912 election, Utah was only one of two states that voted for the Republican incumbent president, William Howard Taft, with Vermont being the other. Taft won 37.5% of the vote, while Wilson won 32.6%. However, it was the 21.5% who voted for progressive candidate and former President Teddy Roosevelt who are the most important here. In 1916, many of Roosevelt's voters in the East had started moving over to the Republican side, but in the West, Roosevelt and Deb voters shifted to the Democrats. Running for re-election in 1916, Wilson swept every county in the state, something no other Democrat at the presidential level had ever done or has done since. The newly elected governor, Simon Baumberger, a Jewish Democrat, won by 13%. All of the statewide elected constitutional offices were won by Democrats. William King, in the first election for U.S. Senator in that class for Utah, won 56.9% of the vote. Both of the congressional seats went to the Democrats, as well as the Utah State Legislature. However, if we look at the cover of the Salt Lake Tribune, we kind of have a Dewey defeats Truman vibe here, but they do say probable. Starting from 1916, over the next few decades, Utah would become a politically balanced state. But unlike during the Smoot-Kearns era, which saw the LDS Church primarily supporting Republican candidates, Mormons were now starting to become equally members of both the Democratic and Republican parties. The reason for this was that both parties were trying to win over LDS and non-LDS members, with ballots having a mixture of candidates of all religious backgrounds. With more Mormons becoming Democrats, thus less staying with the Republicans, non-Mormons became stronger with the Republican Party. One of the organizations that had become strong during this time was the Sevens Club, a secret Republican group dominated by non-Mormons. The reason why they were so strong was because they essentially held the balance of power in Utah. During the term of Governor Charles Mabee, the Sevens Club opposed him, with prominent Republicans asking voters to vote for Salt Lake County State Senator George Dern for governor in 1924. Dern beat the incumbent Mabee by 5%. In 1918, two prominent Utahns died, Thomas Kearns and Joseph F. Smith. With their bitter rivalry coming to an end, leadership in the church, as well as those who ran the Salt Lake Tribune, decided to end the division between the church and the paper. This would eventually lead to Utah politics becoming significantly secular during this time, which further led to religious affiliation not being a determining factor in partisanship. In 1920, the National Democratic Party suffered great defeats and would essentially stay in the political wilderness until the 1930 midterm elections. However, Utah would see a mix of Democrats and Republicans serving in the state. Reed Smoot, who was still popular, basically won elections based on his personality, thus keeping his seat throughout the 1920s. Frank Jonas argues that Smoot himself might have been more popular than the church. But remember, Smoot was a member of the 12, so he did represent the church as well. Still, Smoot was more likely to get the support of genteel businessmen than he would with even other members of the 12. He was heavily influential in making both the Republican Party as well as the LDS Church a cornerstone of unfettered capitalism. As far as both of the congressional seats in Utah, they were held by Republicans, with one district being held by Don Colton, a devout Mormon, and the others being held by two non-Mormon Republicans. As for the governor's mansion, George Dern, the Democrat who won in 1924, won again in 1928, this time by 17%. Senator William H. King would win re-election again in 1922, but only by 561 votes to Ernest Baumberger, the former governor's wealthy nephew who was a Republican. King would win a third term to the U.S. Senate, again beating Baumberger, but winning by more than 11%. When it came to the Utah legislature, the Republicans had success in the mid-1920s, but then the Democrats came back in 1928, reducing the Republican majority in the Utah Senate to 2 seats and in the House by 3. Even though the nation was caught up in Republican fever, the state of Utah was pretty balanced. But then the Great Depression hit. The 1930 elections in Utah actually saw the Republicans do well, but it was the 1932 elections that brought a big blow to the Republicans in Utah. Reed Smoot was confident that he would win re-election to the U.S. Senate. However, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which imposed tariffs on over 20,000 goods, was an accelerant for the Great Depression. As a result, Smoot overwhelmingly lost his seat to Democratic University professor Albert Thomas by nearly 15%. Franklin Roosevelt also won Utah's 4 electoral votes, winning the state by the same margin as Thomas. Henry Blood, the Democrat running for governor, also won by 15%. Democrats took both congressional districts from the Republicans, swept every constitutional office in the state, and dominated county elections, and took control of both the Utah House and Senate. The 1932 election signaled the beginning of an era of Democratic politics in the state, but also a lessening influence of the church on elections. In 1936, the LDS Church endorsed Republican presidential nominee Alf Landon for president through its newspaper, the Deseret News, something that the paper had avoided previously. And what was the result? Franklin Roosevelt won 69% of the vote in Utah. Governor Blood was reelected with 64.6% of the vote, and the Democrats increased their totals in state and local government. On top of that, thousands canceled their subscription to the Deseret News. The church would also threaten to remove members of the church if they introduced legislation that they disagreed with, such as Walter K. Granger, Democrat from Cedar City, who was an LDS bishop and Speaker of the Utah House. Because he supported receiving grants from the federal government, the church threatened to remove him from being a bishop. But the church always threatened and never actually acted on their threats. While the church stopped being directly involved, they continued to practice passively being involved, favoring Republican candidates. Throughout the rest of the 1930s and going into the 1940s, the Democrats continued to perform well. As World War II was starting to die down, Republicans were starting to make gains. Herbert Maw, a Democratic University professor, won the governor's race in 1940 with 52.1% of the vote, with FDR performing 10% better at 62.3% in Utah. Maw would win re-election in 1944, but only win by 1,056 votes. The Republicans would eventually take control of both the state house and Senate, as well as control of counties that they had lost back in the 1930s. Even though the LDS Church was passively supporting Republicans, the governor, both senators, both members of Congress, and a number of others who held office locally were also members of the church. Therefore, the church toned down its rhetoric against the Democrats from the mid 1930s until 1944. Possibly because of Democratic Party fatigue, the Republicans started to claw back after World War II. The first defeat for the Democrats was U.S. Senator Abe Murdoch. In 1940, Murdoch actually defeated Republican Philo Farnsworth by 25%. If that name sounds familiar to you, Farnsworth was given the first ever patent for the television and is a distant descendant of Hubert J. Farnsworth of Futurama. In 1946, Murdoch would lose to Arthur Watkins, a liberal-leaning Republican. The Democrats would also lose one of their two congressional seats. In 1948, Republican J. Bracken Lee would defeat Governor Herbert Maw by 10%, with strong support from church leaders and the Deseret News. Lee was a fiscal right-winger, opposing almost every type of business and income tax. He was also not a member of the LDS Church, though he maintained a good relationship with the church. In fact, Lee is the last person elected as governor of Utah who was not a Mormon. Even with Lee's win, the Democrats won back the congressional seat they lost in 1946, and Truman won the state's presidential vote. In fact, many in Utah voted for Truman because he was seen as tearing the Democratic Party away from the Southern segregationists. But it was the early and mid 1950s that saw the Republican revival in the state. After the 1948 election, the church learned that its influence as a Utah institution wasn't as strong as it was back in the past. But it did learn that its editorials in the Deseret News had a major impact, as it provided an outlet for the LDS Church to give their opinion without it coming directly from the church itself. See, the Deseret News was still the most read paper in Utah, and not only could it attack politicians it didn't like, but give bad news coverage as well. As soon as Senator Albert Thomas was told that he wasn't in favor with the church, the Deseret News didn't attack him as much as they played down his accomplishments. As a result, Wallace Bennett, who was married to the daughter of a former president of the LDS Church, was elected to the U.S. Senate. In 1952, both Governor Lee and Senator Watkins won re-election, and both congressional districts flipped to the Republicans. But 1952 also presented a seismic change in the way that LDS Church members influenced politics. Prior to 1952, the church was more advisory, telling members, or at least hinting to them, that they should vote a certain way. But in 1952, the church activated a Wake Up to Voters campaign, which told members not to just vote in elections, but to become involved civically. According to Jonas, the church, quote, instructed members to attend the district mass meetings where the delegates to the nominating conventions are chosen by secret ballots. The results were evident. In 1954, 95% of all elected public office holders, including in the state legislature, were Mormon. In 1956, 94% of all candidates on the ballot were Mormon, which was disproportionate to the 70% Mormon population in the state. End of quote. But in 1956, there was a bit of a shift in Utah's politics. Governor J. Bracken Lee had originally been considering running for the U.S. Senate against Wallace Bennett for the Republican nomination, but then decided to run for a third term as governor. Lee had made quite a few enemies in the Republican Party circles, both in the state and nationally. He strongly opposed the Eisenhower administration and even refused to pay federal taxes on some of his income in 1955 because he didn't want that income to go to foreign nations. His Republican opponent, George Clyde, was pro-Eisenhower and opposed to a governor having a third term, something that Lee supported when it came to the presidency. Clyde defeated Lee, winning 53.5% of the vote to Lee's 46.5%. Lee would then go on to run as an independent in the general election, facing Clyde and Democrat Rennie Romney. Yes, from that Romney family, and accused Republican Senator Arthur Watkins of being directly responsible for his downfall, saying, quote, "I intend to expose him and his manipulations in the campaign ahead." End of quote. Of course, this made the state Republican Party angry, as his running as a third party candidate could lead to a Democrat win in the governor's race. But Lee wasn't wrong, as Watkins was instrumental in his defeat because Watkins saw Lee as opposing federal funding for which Watkins had been pushing for in the Senate. Though all three candidates were within 10% of each other, Clyde won the governorship. In 1958, Watkins was up for re-election. Lee decided to enter the race as well. Even with most of the Republican votes split between Watkins and Lee, many expected that one of those two would win the election. Democratic candidate Frank Moss, an attorney from Salt Lake City, was expected to finish second or third since the Democrats had been in the political wilderness as of late. However, according to Jonas, the Moss campaign strategy was to boost Lee's appeal with Republican voters while stripping Lee's support amongst Democratic voters, shifting the electorate, which was done through a massive phone banking operation. In fact, this was one of the first campaigns that used telephones and precinct canvassing as its primary way of contacting and identifying voters. To much surprise, Moss actually finished first with 38.7% of the vote, just 4% ahead of Watkins. However, there was a national wave for the Democrats as well as in the states. The Democrats won the 2nd congressional district as well as winning both chambers of the Utah legislature. By 1960, both national Democrats and Republicans were courting the Mormon vote for president. Democratic nominee John F. Kennedy spoke at the Mormon Tabernacle on September 23, 1960, at the invitation of LDS Church President David O. McKay. Remember the guy I mentioned earlier who said that his father was a Jeffersonian Democrat. One of the reasons why McKay might have felt comfortable with Kennedy was that both men were extremely anti-communist, which you can learn more about in my video about Kennedy's first congressional campaign. But when Kennedy gave his speech at the Mormon Tabernacle, the way in which he spoke was different than how other non-Utahns had spoken in the past. According to Jonas, quote, well-informed Mormons stated that Kennedy sounded better versed in Mormon history and doctrine than any other Gentile who had ever spoken in Salt Lake City. They hinted that probably an apostle had had a hand in preparing his speech. For example, he referred to the prophet Joseph Smith, what Brigham Young had said when the Lord revealed to him, and what the Lord said in section 101 of the Doctrine and Covenants. While Kennedy would go on to still lose Utah, he did improve on Adlai Stevenson's 1956 number by nearly 10%. George Clyde would win re-election as governor, but only by 5.2%. The Democrats would retain both houses of the legislature as well as pick up the 1st congressional district, now holding both seats. When David O. McKay became president of the LDS Church in 1951, the church strongly supported Republican candidates. But by the early 1960s, the church started to stay out of political affairs. The church even went as far as releasing an editorial clarifying their wish to remain out of elections. This was particularly because of one candidate, Republican Reed Benson. Benson was the secretary of the far-right John Birch Society, as well as the son of Ezra Taft Benson, who was Secretary of Agriculture under Eisenhower, as well as a member of the 12 and a John Birch Society member. The Deseret News editorial on August 23, 1962, stated that it would not take sides in any election. This essentially meant that the church would not support the son of one of the 12 for Congress. Benson would go on to lose a Republican nomination to Sherman Lloyd for Utah's 2nd congressional district. The Republicans won both seats in 1962, as well as taking over both chambers of the Utah legislature, as well as all incumbents retaining their positions. Still, Lyndon Johnson, who was to become president after the assassination of Kennedy, kept a close relationship with David O. McKay and the church. He invited McKay to the White House on January 30th, 1964, continued to communicate with McKay, and made two campaign stops in Utah on his way to sweeping the presidency in November, which included the state of Utah. Frank Moss was easily reelected to the Senate, but the sweep did bring changes to state government, with Democrat Cal Rampton easily winning the governor's race with 57% of the vote. The Democrats also regained control of both chambers of the Utah legislature. The era between 1964 and 1976 could be known as the era of incumbents. Governor Cal Rampton would win two more terms, winning in 1968 and 1972. Wallace Bennett would win in 1968, but then decided not to seek re-election in 1974, supporting Republican Jake Garn, who would eventually replace him. Frank Moss would win re-election in 1970 as well. Regarding the congressional seats, they would flip back and forth between the two parties, as well as control of the Utah House and Senate. At the presidential level, Nixon won in 1968, with Hubert Humphrey basically ignoring Utah, unlike Kennedy and Johnson. But 1976 was the year that we can see the birth of the current Republican era in Utah politics. This transformation probably first started when the president of the Quorum of the 12, Ezra Taft Benson, started heavily speaking about politics. Yes, he was the Secretary of Agriculture under Eisenhower, but also one of the furthest right-wing people in Utah's political history. He viewed the civil rights movement as a fraud, which was mostly just a communist conspiracy, which led George Wallace to consider him as his running mate in 1968. He was also a member of the John Birch Society, a far-right conservative movement on all issues. He also had an anti-interventionist view on foreign policy. When Benson gave speeches at the general conferences, he highly invoked politics while the church was trying to move away from being political. Basically, he was a high-profile individual within the church leadership who was very influential, very popular, and very conservative. He would eventually go on to serve as president of the church. With the conservatives being more vocal, especially amongst voices in the church, the first domino fell, which was the defeat of Frank Moss in 1976. Moss ran against Orrin Hatch, a relatively unknown attorney, a year earlier. Hatch's main argument for his election was that Moss had been serving too long in the U.S. Senate, now in his 18th year. Though Hatch would later be known as one of the earliest diehard conservatives in the Senate, he didn't campaign on those issues in 1976. He mostly campaigned on good governance and his qualifications to be elected to the U.S. Senate, as well as Moss being there for too long, famously saying, quote, "What do you call a senator who's serving in office for 18 years? You call him home," end of quote. Hatch beat Moss by 9%. To date, Moss is the last Democrat to serve in the United States Senate for the state of Utah. At the state level, the Democrats lost both the Utah State House and Senate. The Democrats have never controlled either chamber since. The Democrats lost every constitutional officer's position and haven't won the state auditor or state treasurer position since. The Republicans also gained the 2nd Congressional District, with the first staying Democratic, with Kay Gunn McKay, the cousin of now past President David O. McKay, who died in 1970. Still, even though Cal Rampton didn't run for a 4th term as governor, his replacement, Scott Matheson, won, but by a much reduced margin, 17.7% less than Rampton, winning 52% of the vote over Utah's Attorney General Vernon Romney. Yes, of that family again. 1978 was a quiet year, as there were no statewide elections and the congressional seats remained the same. In 1980, Matheson won the governorship by a slightly increased margin over chairman of the Republican Party of Utah, Bob Wright. However, James Hansen would win the other congressional seats, with the Republicans now holding all seats in Washington. Ronald Reagan won Utah with 72.8% of the vote. In the 1980s, two major shifts happened in the National Republican Party, which accelerated the success of Republicans in Utah. First was the rise of the moral majority, which was the religious conservative movement. While the movement was more focused on evangelical Christians and not Mormons, both groups' views on religious issues intersected, such as abortion and gay marriage. The second shift was that the Republicans became more focused on fiscal conservatism and unfettered capitalism. This again aligned with the views of many LDS members. Therefore, more Mormons found their way over to the Republicans. In 1984, Reagan won 74.5% of the vote in Utah. Scott Matheson decided not to run for re-election, with Wayne Owens, who had served in Congress for the Democrats in the 1970s, running to replace Matheson. He would lose by 12% to Norm Bangerter. No other Democrat has served as governor since Matheson was the governor. The only high-profile races that the Democrats would win in the rest of the 1980s was the 2nd Congressional District in 1986, with Wayne Owens returning to Congress, and Paul Van Dam, who would become Utah's Attorney General in 1988. Van Dam received a lot of publicity for being the prosecutor against Ted Bundy. However, he only served one term, which ended in 1992. The 1990s were not much better for the Democrats. Even though Van Dam decided not to run, Democrat Jan Graham decided to run for Attorney General and won, with tobacco lawsuit settlements being the backbone of her success. Since the LDS Church was strongly against the use of tobacco, her strong anti-tobacco stance kept her in office. Wayne Owens continued in Congress until he decided to run for the U.S. Senate in 1992. Incumbent Jake Garn decided to retire, leaving the seat open. The Republican nominee was Bob Bennett, the son of Wallace Bennett. I mean, they look exactly alike. Seriously, exactly alike. Bennett would go on to win by 15%, ending Owens' political career. Because Owens was running for the Senate, his congressional seat was open, which was won by Democrat Karen Shepard, who was a state senator at the time. She would then lose her seat 2 years later in 1994, mostly for her support for Bill Clinton's agenda. The most interesting win in the 1990s was that of Democrat Bill Orton in Utah's 3rd Congressional District in 1990. Orton was expected to easily lose, as the 3rd Congressional District was one of the most Republican districts in the nation. The person who was expected to win was Carl Snow, a Republican state senator at the time. Orton was a conservative Democrat, a bishop in the LDS Church, as well as pro-life. Therefore, he wasn't your typical Democrat. Orton was also a bachelor and never having been married. Snow's campaign tried to take advantage of this. Stephen Studdard, who worked with Snow as his honorary campaign chairman, convinced the campaign to run an ad featuring Snow's family next to a photo of just Orton's face, with the caption reading, "Bill Orton and his family" under Orton's picture. Many saw this ad as Snow saying that Orton was gay, which he was not. This had had a severe backlash, which led to Orton's win. On election night, Orton would say, quote, "That ad was very offensive to a lot of people in the district. It clearly backfired against the Republicans. I think there was a groundswell of people who found that totally offensive." End of quote. Orton would serve in Congress until 1997, when he lost to Republican Chris Cannon in 1996. From the year 2000 until now, the political climate would somewhat change for the Democrats. For the most part, Democrats were considered a moderate party that had appeal in Salt Lake County, but enough throughout the state that some moderate to conservative Democrats could win. In 2000, Jim Matheson, the centrist son of the former governor, Scott Matheson, won Utah's 2nd Congressional District, which was still only Salt Lake County. But in 2002, the Republican legislature redrew the district, which now included extremely conservative parts of the state. Still, Matheson would win re-election in 2002 and continue to run until 2010. In 2012, the Utah legislature drew an unwinnable seat for any Democrat, and Matheson decided not to run. But starting in the early 2000s, the Democrats were becoming more liberal and more anti Mormon, creating splits that had opened up in the past. This pushed the party further to the left, especially in Salt Lake County and particularly in Salt Lake City, now one of the most left leaning cities in the United States, with left wing Mayor Rocky Anderson becoming a face of Salt Lake Democrats. With this shift, Democratic candidate recruitment wasn't the best. For example, in 2004, the Democrats' candidate for state auditor was a UPS driver. The last glimmer of hope for the Democrats was the victory of Ben McAdams in 2018. Adams, a centrist Democrat and Salt Lake County mayor, ran against Republican Mia Love, the incumbent for Utah's 4th congressional district. However, Love was very vocal against Donald Trump, which led many Republicans skipping the race on the ballot. McAdams would win by a mere 694 votes. 2 years later, McAdams would lose the seat to Burgess Owens, a football player with no relation to Wayne Owens, by only 1%. Since 2018, Democrats haven't had any major victories. While Democrats are making inroads in other parts of the state, the party's strength is still primarily in Salt Lake County and Park City. As for the Republicans, they continue to be kind of a big tent party. They are socially conservative, but might be considered fiscally all over the place. They support lower taxes, but continue to spend money on expanding public transit. There are moderates like newly elected Senator John Curtis, who, fun fact, used to be the Democratic Party chairman in Utah County, but changed when he realized he couldn't win as a Democrat in that county. And then there are those like Mike Lee, who, well, support whatever the hell this is. And while some Republican voters might be turning more to the Democrats at the presidential level, they still remain Republicans locally. But still, as the candidacy of Evan McMullin for president in 2016 showed, many Republican voters still aren't happy with right wing politics or Donald Trump's ethical decay. With that, we are done with today's video. If you would like to see some more videos about American politics, go ahead and check out the playlist above. If you would like to check out international elections, the playlist below has some international elections. Remember, if you want to be a Patreon member, click in the description below. There is a link down there for my Patreon. Thank you all very much, and I will see you in the next video.